Here.
Ready.
Hello and welcome, everybody. Hope you're here for the Even Year Elections for All, how U.S. localities are raising voter turnout session for Netroots Nation. My name is Will Easton. I'm your moderator today. I'll be mostly behind the scenes. Feel free to chat me if you have any technical issues, but we do want to dive right into the panel. I want to remind everybody of a couple things. These sessions are being recorded, both for your convenience as well as for other folks who will see that in the Netroots app later. You can drop questions into the questions space. Should be a little button either on your phone, it's down at the bottom, or on your web browser, it's at the upper right. And let's see, what else do I need to let you know here? Also, if you're playing in the Netroots game, there's a little game in the app. Our code for today is democracy. So enter that, you'll win some points. And we'll get started in just a minute here. And thanks so much. See if we're live. Okay, it looks like we are live. So one more time on those announcements. Hi, everybody. Will Easton with Netroots Nation here. Excited for this panel called Even Year Elections for All, how U.S. localities are raising voter turnout. Great group of panelists today. Want to remind you of a couple things. The session is being recorded and will be available afterwards. You can get it in the app. So can everybody else who's attending Netroots Nation. If you have questions, please put those in the questions space. That little button is upper right in a web browser or down towards the lower right if you're with us from a mobile phone. I do want to let you know that I'm available for questions or technical problems, but I'll mostly be off stage. So post something in the chat and I'll try to help you. And also want to let you know that if you're participating in the Netroots game, today's code word is democracy. And that'll win you some points in the game, in the app. So enough of me. I want to turn it over to Andrew Villeneuve of Northwest Progressives. He'll introduce the other panelists. Andrew, go ahead. Take it from here.
Thank you so much, Will. Thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm Andrew Villeneuve from the Northwest Progressive Institute, and just honored to be with all of you today for this great discussion about even year elections. We only have an hour, so we're going to dive right into it. I'd like to go ahead and invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll begin our discussion. So, Chelsea, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Castellano.
Okay. Augustine? You might be muted.
Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Augustine Mercarian, assistant professor at Loyola University.
And Zoli.
And I am Zoli Heinel, professor at UC San Diego and co-director of the Yankelovich Center for Social Science Research.
Thanks so much. So we're just going to dive right into it, as I said, because we only have an hour. So we're going to first start with an overview of the problem that even year elections are trying to address and the consequences that those lead to. And I'm going to kick it back over to Zoli to talk about what that problem is. Zoli?
Thanks, Andrew. And I also want to echo Andrew's thanks to you all out there for spending time with us and for being committed to trying to improve our local democracy. So as Andrew briefly indicated, we're here to spend a few minutes to talk to you about election timing. And essentially, we want to show you why election timing is so important for local democracy and who's represented, who participates, and the policies that follow. First, what do we mean by election timing? The core concept here is very simple. It's whether or not we hold local elections on the same day as federal elections. So essentially, when we vote for mayor, city council, school board, and so on, are we voting on the first Tuesday of November in even years, or are we voting on some other relatively random day unconnected to statewide and federal elections? So that's the core concept. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And I think that at its most basic level, the problem we're trying to solve is low and uneven turnout. So if we look across the country, turnout in local elections, again, for mayor, city council, school board, and so on, is extraordinarily low. Only about a quarter of us participate in local elections on average. And figures for school board and other types of local elections, special districts, can be much lower than that. So 10% of citizens or even less than that. And the limited data we have suggests that the problem is getting worse rather than better. So we have low turnout. We also have extremely uneven turnout. So who's coming out to vote in local elections? is greatly skewed by race, by age, and by class. So local voters are much more likely than local non-voters to be white, to be relatively wealthy, and to be older. Putting a little more detail on that, whites are essentially twice as likely as Asian Americans and Latinos to participate. The rich are roughly twice as likely to vote as the poor, and older Americans are about 3 times more likely to participate than younger Americans broadly across these types of elections. So big problem, small and extremely unrepresentative electorate is deciding policy and outcomes at the local level. Not surprisingly, that means that uneven turnout leads to uneven outcomes. So winners in policies at the local level often favor special interests. They often favor advantaged interests. We know that the views of council members around the country don't line up all that well with the views of the average citizen. We know in particular that the views of people of color are especially unlikely to be represented through the views of the average council member around the country. So, and we further, just looking at other outcomes, great underrepresentation of people of color in terms of who's holding office. Basically 90% or roughly 90% of local offices are held by white Americans, and few working class Americans get elected. And again, in the end, policies tend to favor a set of special interests over the broader public. So that's, in a nutshell, the problem. How did we get here? Is it one really quickly brief history I want to highlight here. Low and uneven turnout at the local level is no accident. So most local elections are held off cycle on a different day from federal elections, largely because of reforms that occurred about a century ago. So wealthy reformers who wanted to take control of city government around the country could only do that by lowering turnout and limiting participation of immigrants, minorities, and the working class. So to do that, their solution was to change the rules of the game to make it harder to participate, and in so doing, effectively limit the regular participation in local elections to a more advantaged, often whiter population. So we have low and uneven turnout, and we have it, unfortunately, for sort of these specific historical reasons. And I'll pass it off to the rest of this great crew next.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes now talking about what the solution is, which is, of course, even year elections is what you're here for. So we call this the even year upgrade because, as Zoli mentioned, you get a lot more voters participating and you get a lot more diverse turnout when you move local elections to even years. In fact, voting in even years for local positions is essentially costless because people are already coming out to vote for those state and federal positions that we hear so much about in the media. We know that press coverage of politics is higher in even numbered years because of those federal elections. And we also know that there's a lot more resources put into turning people out to vote in even numbered years, resources that are not expended in odd numbered years. So let's talk for a minute about the benefits of the upgrade and why it's so powerful as an electoral reform and why nothing else comes close. First of all, it's important to note with respect to raising turnout on cycle elections, which is the term that you'll hear a lot during this hour for even years, that doubles voter turnout. Also, on cycle elections increases the representativeness of turnout. You'll see less Black, Latino, and Asian American underrepresentation. And typically in places around the country, what we see is that there's less of a cost to administer these on-cycle elections. And then finally, they make policy more responsive to everyone. To vote in an odd-numbered year, voters have to learn the date of the election. They have to find their polling place. They have to make time to go to the polls or to fill in a vote-at-home ballot, which is what we have in Washington State, where I'm from. And they need to fill out the local questions that are on the ballot. But in an even-numbered year, an on-cycle election, voters who are already there just need to fill out the local questions that get added onto the ballot. So it's a huge upgrade. And the research is very conclusive on this. We have 10 published studies comparing on-cycle and off-cycle elections, and they've all found that the timing impacts turnout and that participation goes way up. So moving to on-cycle, it's the single most effective change that local governments can undertake to increase turnout. There was some real sort of light bulbs going off when we were doing our measure last year in King County. When local officials were discovering this data, they were just beside themselves. They couldn't believe that one change could have so much impact. And yet that's what the data shows. No other rules change or procedural reform is close to this. You can have more polling places. You can have early voting. You can update your voter registration systems. Anything else that's been tried, at most, it raises turnout by a few points. This could as much as double it, as well as diversifying it. And conversely, as you heard, there's nothing that local governments can do that does more to reduce turnout than holding those standalone local elections. So that's the solution. And what we've seen in places across the country is it's also very popular. There were 13 ballot measures last year that concerned moving the timing to even numbered years, and they were all successful. And that's because people want them. And it doesn't matter what the jurisdiction was. We saw one in Florida. We had some in California and Colorado, Washington State. They all passed. And there's been legislation in places like New York and Montana that's been proposed. I think New York's legislation is now before the governor, and Montana, I think they might have not quite gotten all the way to the governor's desk, but they certainly had an active discussion this year. So that's two states that are very different. Montana and New York are Democratic and Republican controlled, and yet they're both looking at this. So it's something that really transcends the different political divide that we see out there, where people have strong views about many different issues, but this is one where you're going to find a lot of cross-ideological support. And now I'd like to introduce, we had another panelist join us. I'd like her to introduce herself and then talk about how localities are getting it done community by community. We had some success in California last year, and I'd like to highlight that. So Kathy, if you would mind introducing yourself, that'd be great. And then talk about what we've seen in Los Angeles and in California over the last few years.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Kathy Fung with Common Cause. I am the Vice President of Programs, and apologize, I'm feeling a little frazzled today because yesterday we had a gigantic decision coming out of the Supreme Court with Moore v. Harper that protected, I think, some fundamental notions of the balance of power between legislatures and courts. Let me just say that on this issue, how we started to think about this really was that in California, a number of our cities as well as state elections had really dismal voter turnout when it came to the off-year elections. So in odd years, sometimes even in even years, but in March or months that were not aligned with the statewide election calendar. And we looked at research that had been done by Zoltan and team, right, that actually had pointed out that there was a natural experiment that had occurred in California, where some cities that used to have odd year elections had moved to even year elections. And the jump in voter participation was dramatic. It went from sometimes single digit participation, so 7%, sometimes 12%, to 35% and then over 50% when it was aligned with the November even year election. And from an activist perspective, one of the things that we realized was that the amount of time that we spend just trying to educate people about when the election is, not even why they should vote, what's on the ballot, you know, how to meaningfully get to the polling place or cast the ballot. So much time was spent just telling them this is the election day. I know it's really odd and it's in the middle of like nobody else's election season, that we knew that this was a really important reform. At the same time, the conversation was also starting up about what had just happened in Ferguson, where the shooting of Michael Brown was then contextualized in a city council that was entirely unrepresentative of the city of Ferguson. And part of that was that Ferguson had off-year elections. And so the people who kept getting elected, demographically and representationally, had nothing to do and were disconnected from the Black population of Ferguson. And so one of the things that we made a very conscious decision about was, if we want to increase turnout, but not only increase turnout, but to make sure that the representation is demographically aligned with the population at large, we need to remove this major barrier. We looked at this on a lot of different levels. So in California, we have charter cities. We have cities that are general law cities that follow whatever the state requires. And then we have statewide laws that apply to everything. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to tackle this on two different levels. At the charter city level, we had we initiated a conversation with Los Angeles City, developed a report, sat on commissions, pushed the conversation, really had to work through a lot of city council members to help them understand that even if they consider themselves to be progressive, a lot of times the idea of unknown voters coming to the polls is very scary for them. And their consultants will oftentimes push back. So the pushback is sometimes even from people who we might consider to be friends, who agree with us on many other policy issues. And helping them to understand that this is not only sort of quote unquote good for democracy, but it also in the long run is advantageous, right? Is something that was a real learning curve for a lot of electeds. In charter cities, what that meant was developing something that would ultimately go to the ballot. So we did a lot of polling to help people understand and to also understand how to frame the issue for voters who are ultimately going to have to vote on it. Separately, we also had a parallel track at the state level to try to pass a law that would require all cities that were non-charter cities to move their elections to an even year election cycle if they could show that, and the big if was this was a big compromise with all of the cities that were freaking out, if they could show that their voter turnout or if they could not show that their voter turnout was comparable in off years as it was with even years. And that meant 95% of the cities had to move to an even year election cycle because in odd years, their election turnout was dismal, again, in the single digits or the very low double digits. Ultimately, both of those reforms passed, and we now see when the city of Los Angeles has elections in the even year, the heightened attention to the elections at the local level, the heightened participation that goes all the way down the ballot, and then in other non-charter cities, that similar kind of turnaround. One of the reforms that got adopted as part of this discussion has to do with ballot drop-off. And so I'm just going to name it, and then people can kind of think about what you want to do with it. But this is how we solved for that problem in California. The big concern was if you move city election on the same ballot as state and national, people are going to go to the ballot and have a really strong idea of who they want to vote for president, maybe for congressional member. And as you go down the list, they're going to have less and less interest. And they may just drop off in interest by the time they get to page 5. They're not going to vote on the local elections. And so we had a lot of people raise the concern that we were going to hurt local city voter turnout because it was down ballot. In fact, actually, the research shows otherwise, that even when there is drop off, it's still higher. Thank you, Zoltan, for all of that research. However, it's still hard to convince people when they don't want to change, because ultimately, a lot of times the people that we have to convince are electeds who have won under the system that, got them there. They don't want to change it. So what the change that we did was we said cities or counties can work to flip the order of the ballot so that city elections come first. So president's always at the top, but city can come first, and then you're statewide. Many of our jurisdictions have chosen to flip the order of the ballot. so that that kind of drop off doesn't happen. And it has allowed for a lot more adoption to happen in a willing way as opposed to an unwilling way. It has fundamentally changed the turnout. It has also changed who gets elected. And it has changed the dynamics of the conversation that candidates and their campaigns have. Now, spending a little less time only talking to the highly likely voter, but now also including in the conversation those people who vote less frequently. And we've seen a huge turnaround in Los Angeles, aided by a few scandals that have happened, but a lot of city council members who are non-incumbents who have been elected to office as a result. Total changeover in the makeup. Thanks.
Andrew, I think you're
Sorry,
muted.
I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much. Chelsea, do you want to carry the conversation forward and tell us about what's happening in Colorado?
Sure. Hello again. I'm Chelsea Castellano. I currently serve as the Colorado Program Director at America Votes, but today I'm here in my capacity as the founder, co-founder and co-lead of an initiative that moved off-cycle elections to even years in Boulder, Colorado, just in 2022. So I wanted to share with you just a little bit of my origin story of how I became such a strong proponent of even year elections for local contests. In 2020, I ran a citizen-led ballot initiative in Boulder, Colorado to reform some very exclusionary housing laws. After months of organizing hundreds of volunteers and collecting signatures during a pandemic to get our initiative on the ballot, our, at the time, conservative city council, who was opposed to our measure, retroactively changed their interpretation of the election laws to prevent our measure from getting on the ballot in 2020. They doubled the number of signatures required and changed the deadline 2 months prior from the date that they were doing it. So we sued the city, and it went all the way up to the Colorado Supreme Court, where they decided not to make a decision. So we were back to square one. We decided we weren't going to let that stop us. We collected the signatures again in 2021 and got on the ballot. But we lost by 2 percentage points, and it was devastating. But we dug into the voter data to figure out what went wrong, and it was very obvious. What went wrong is that off-cycle elections systematically disenfranchise young people, working people, renters, and communities of color. So while our housing measure didn't pass, we did help get a progressive majority elected to city council that year. And the day after the election, we had meetings with that new majority where we laid out the case to move our off-cycle elections to even years. And they would put the measure on the ballot, and we would run the campaign to get it passed, which we lovingly called People for Voter Turnout. And that is what we did. And we won in November with 63% support. Now, there's a lot of advice I want to share with anyone who is interested in doing this work. So please reach out to me afterwards. I could talk about this topic all day long, but because I only have a few minutes, I do want to highlight 4 key steps to running a successful campaign to moving off-cycle elections to even years. One is that the data is compelling, doing an election analysis for your city specifically to show the discrepancies in turnout and representation between off-cycle elections and even years, and then showing that in a really graphical and digestible way for people to easily see those differences. For example, we created a simple bar graph showing voter turnout for every year for the past decade. So you can see this like seesaw effect where off-cycle elections never breach 51% turnout, while even year elections fluctuate between 72 and 90% turnout over the span of a decade. So it's important to show that this historical data because it demonstrates the issue is systemic, and therefore the solution needs to be solved at that system level as well. We use data and visualizations to show the significant differences in young people, turnout of young people, communities of color within our community. And that helped us to make the case and get endorsements from groups like the NAACP, the ACLU, Working Families Party, and others that aligned with our values. So know that the research is on your side. As one of my esteemed fellow panelists points out, every single published study on election timing and voter turnout shows that combining local elections with state and federal elections is the single most effective change that governments can make to increase turnout. So use the research and highlight the key points to demonstrate that this is a well-studied, tested, and effective change that your community can and should benefit from. And this will help your community and constituents feel more comfortable making this change, knowing that it's happened before. Second is strong and consistent messaging. So we ran a statistically valid messaging poll where we took what we thought were the strongest pro-messaging arguments, and we asked people how convincing each message was. And we did the same thing for the opposition messaging. And what we found was overwhelmingly, there were 3 most convincing messages across the board, whether you looked at it from age, race, voter history. We tried to figure out like which groups thought these messages were the most convincing, and every group thought these were the most convincing. And number 1 was more voters means a stronger democracy. Boulder should hold its elections in even years when nearly twice as many people vote. 2, even year elections are more representative in terms of race, ethnicity, age, and income. 3, democracy works best when all of our voices are heard. And we repeated these messages throughout the campaign on our website and our campaign materials. It was overwhelmingly positive pro-democracy campaign, and I believe that is important to winning on this issue. 3, as my Kathy mentioned, it's important to know that going into this, it is very, very likely, almost inevitable, that a subset of establishment Democrats or just Democrats will not support this change and will go out of their way to oppose it. We experienced that. They were elected in a certain paradigm and they don't want to change that paradigm. And the important thing is to remember that there will be many people and elected officials who will support you. So my advice is don't worry too much about those who oppose you, because when it comes down to it, the reasons for opposing this are not convincing or compelling to the majority. It does turn out that more people want more people voting. And 4th, if it wasn't abundantly obvious, run your ballot initiative in an even year. And I can pass it on.
Thank you so much. That was great. And now I'd like to invite Augustine to tell us about the benefits of inclusion, how we can get more diverse turnout when we switch to even year elections, because that's one of the most important benefits.
Hi. Okay, let's make sure my slides are sharing.
We see them.
Perfect. All right. So I think we've heard a lot about how even year elections can make the electorate more representative so far. So we're going to dive into a little bit of that data and look a little bit at the impact of what even year elections are also having on who wins elections, and also on what policies local cities are passing, how reflective that policy is. So one of the things that now we know pretty well is that switching from off-cycle to on-cycle local elections not only increases turnout, but it also reduces turnout gaps. By this, what I mean is that it increases turnout among young people, people of color, less wealthy individuals, and that this also has an impact on the number of Democrats or liberals and progressives. Zoli, me, and Vlad did a study in Vlad Kogan did a study in California that had this sort of dynamic where a lot of cities were changing to even year elections for some of the reasons that Kathy described. And so we were able to study what the impact of this change was. And we found in California that switching to on-cycle local elections increased turnout, particularly among Latino and Asian Americans, young voters, less wealthy individuals, and Democrats and left-leaning voters, liberals, and progressives. And so I think Mama always told me never to use a pie chart, but I think in this case, it actually can be pretty it can show pretty well sort of these different dynamics. And so if we compare, for example, the share of the Latino electorate in off-cycle elections to the actual California population, we see pretty significant disparities. In off-cycle elections, only about 18% of the electorate is Latino, compared to 28% of the California population that is Latino. Similarly, for Asian Americans, we see that only about 7.7% of the electorate in off-cycle elections is Asian American, but 15% of the California's population is Asian American. And we see an overrepresentation of white voters as well when it comes to off-cycle elections. Now let's compare this to the electorate of on-cycle elections. we see that these two charts, right, look, in this case, look much more even. Latino voter turnout increases drastically by about 8% of percentage points. So in on-cycle local elections, about 25% of the electorate is Latino in California, much closer to the 28% of the total population. For Asian Americans, this goes up from 7.7% to 10%, a lot closer to the 15% of California's population that is Asian American. And so this gets us pretty close to parity, especially if we think about differences in age, citizenship status. We see that the population and the electorate are pretty close to parity. They match pretty closely when we have on-cycle elections. When we think even about other policies like mail-in voting, early voting, and even some of the more racialized policies like voter ID laws, their effects are nowhere close to the impact of on-cycle elections and election timing on the composition of the racial composition of the electorate. But it's not just about race. There's also impacts on the average age of the electorate and how many young people turn out to vote. So in California, during off-cycle local elections, nearly half of the electorate is over the age of 55. This is pretty drastic, right? Half of the electorate. And only 13.2% of the electorate is under the age of 40. Not under the age of 25, not under the age of 30, under the age of 40. Switching to on-cycle local elections nearly doubles the share of the electorate that's under the age of 40. It goes from 13.2% to 25.2%. And a lot of these gains come from a much lower proportion of the electorate being over the age of 55. So a lot less bias towards older, whiter Americans. We also see smaller but important increases or gains when it comes to wealth or the wealth distribution of the electorate. So the share of voters that have wealth over $100,000 drops from about 14% to about 11.5%. We also see gains on the lower end of the wealth distribution. The share of voters that have wealth under $30,000, their share of the electorate increases by about 3%. These findings also show up when we look at home ownership, for example. The share of the electorate that are homeowners is a lot higher in off-cycle elections than on-cycle elections. And this really matters when we think about a lot of important local policies that are related to property taxes and how fair the tax system is, schools, policing. We can see how the racial distribution of the electorate, the percentage of the electorate that are homeowners, the wealth of the electorate can really matter for a lot of these policies. And so in some ongoing research, we're also looking at whether this change in the electorate also affects elections. And so in another paper I have with Vladimir Kogan and Zoli Hajnal, one of our panelists, suggests that when cities switch to on-cycle local elections, more Latino candidates run for office, more Latino candidates win office. And these effects are strongest in cities with a larger Latino population. So in cities with a particularly large Latino population, in the top 33% of the distribution, off-cycle to on-cycle local elections lead to about 0.5 more Latino candidates winning office. So a pretty significant impact on how city councils look, how mayoral seats look. We don't see any clear effects for Asian Americans and Black candidates, but I think this has a lot to do with the racial composition of California itself. So these effects are strongest when a city has more voters of color, more voters from a particular demographic. Other research suggests that women are more likely to win city council seats and school board seats when cities switch to on-cycle elections, but might win fewer mayoral seats. There are important, also impacts on policy. So on-cycle local elections reduce the influence of special interest groups. They lead to policy that's a lot more in line with constituents' ideologies. And in research that I'm also doing with Zoli and Vlad, we're finding pretty interesting effects when it comes to how cities spend money and raise money, particularly from a racial equity perspective. So we find that cities collect less revenue from fines and ticketing, from police fines and police ticketing when cities switch to on-cycle local elections. Um, we might think, why does this matter? Well, oftentimes when cities get a lot of their money from fines and ticketing, this is on the backs of poor people of color. It's not equally distributed. This is a lot more regressive tax policy than, say, property taxes, for example. But we also find that cities might spend a little bit more money on public safety, which maybe does make sense and what maybe some voters of color or low-income voters want. We plan on looking at arrest data next. This goes a lot. This goes pretty closely hand in hand with what Cassie was saying that happened in Ferguson and why that matters. So a lot of interesting research has been done here. We're doing trying to do a little bit more, but clear evidence that switching to on-cycle local elections has beneficial impacts for communities of color and for representation of communities overall. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. And you can see, folks, the benefits are substantial. Let's take a few questions that people have submitted who are watching the panel, and then I'll also be asking our panelists to respond to a question about what are some of the most common arguments we hear against even year elections and how can you respond to them. But first, let's take an audience question. Someone asks, doesn't location have impact on if someone votes in a local municipal election? Bigger cities are more likely to get voters out than smaller cities and towns. Who wants to take this one?
I will give a half answer to that one. So when we've done the analysis of increases in voter turnout, we didn't see dramatically different increases in larger cities versus smaller cities. So it looks like this is a fairly consistent, comprehensive effect regardless of the size of your city. And the reason for that is you're coupling your local election with a presidential election. So, every time you move on cycle to November of even years, you're coupling with a presidential election or a midterm election. And it's those bigger ticket items that are driving the higher turnout. And so you're going to see that in both smaller places and larger places is what we have discovered so far.
Thank you. And does anyone else want to take that? Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the next audience question we got. All right. So the next audience question is from someone in Ohio. And it reads, unfortunately, our city government here in Columbus seems to prefer having their municipal elections in odd years. Lower turnout helps them win. Any good arguments you can think of to get them to see a broader self-interest in this key swing state? Who wants to go first?
One of the things that we did, so in Los Angeles, we met with a lot of initial resistance. And to be honest, we started out by meeting with city council members one by one, just to kind of understand, like, what are the dynamics of how they're thinking about this. And so sometimes it helps to kind of peel the onion so that you get at the core of the thing that they're really worried about, right? Eventually, what we ended up being able to do was to work through one of the city council members who, interestingly enough, was one of the most cynical, right? But we managed to get them to agree to creating a commission, right, to look at issues overall about voter turnout, voter participation, voter education. And through that process, which we were pretty active on, we identified a number of different issues and had a conversation, right? And it's how we sort of crafted a couple of the compromises that we did, like flipping the order of the ballot. I think sometimes what you got to figure out is how to get beyond the initial knee-jerk reaction, like change is scary and I don't like da-da-da, to figuring out the why. What is it? Is it about the unknown of the voter? Is it about falling lower on a ballot where you're going to be, non-existent? Is it about the expense of elections? Because when you combine the two, now you've got to pay for ads that are during, prime time ad season. And once you've figured out what the nut of the opposition is, then trying to work through how you can solve for that. Sometimes it is not just about moving the timing of the elections, it's wrapped up in some other logistics. And I'll say the other thing is that we got to talking also to, we figured out who their election consultants were. Who are the people who run their campaigns? Because sometimes it is about the candidate or the elected. Sometimes it's also about the people that they hear, who run campaigns a certain way. And so finding one or two of those folks that we might turn from being opposition to allies helped to kind of get in the ears of the candidates themselves to say, okay, if we can solve for that problem, then we can work through what an even year election cycle looks like.
Yeah, I just want to add that this might also just vary a lot, context to context, and institutional rules to institutional rules. But if a city council doesn't want to play ball for whatever reason, if not enough people are on board with the movement, and you've tried all these approaches and you're just not hearing positive feedback. Local level referendums have been an option that a lot of voters have taken up to try to pass these initiatives. In a lot of places, this has been passed by voters through referendums. And other times, voters and activists have gone up to the state level and achieved changes at the state level. This is happening in California. It's happening in New York. It's happening in Montana. It's happened in Nevada as well. So if there's different venues for reforms and different avenues to get there. So start off with like the lowest hanging fruit. If you think your city council might be, open to this, and do your best to convince them. That might be the easiest way forward. But if not, there's, see if local referendum is an option. See if there's a state legislator that's on board. Maybe just fear of having the state get involved in local politics might get the city council moving on it and complying on themselves instead of having the state forcing them to do it. They might seem like the much more altruistic or positive actor in that case. So just think about those options if you see that your city council is not really moving forward on this, and you've tried everything you feel like you can.
That's a really good point. And also, if you're in an area that's Republican controlled, look at what a state like Montana is doing, where the Republicans are in charge and they're making these arguments. So that way your Republican leaders can see that other Republicans are making these arguments. And if you're in a Democratic area, you can do the same. Say, well, look at these Democratic places that are doing this, and look at how local officials there are on board and embracing the higher and more diverse turnout that you get with even your elections. And that, I think, can help in terms of trying to get a breakthrough. We also know there's some other common arguments out there. I'm going to raise a few of these that we haven't really touched on as much yet. We touched on a couple of them, including like what's the order of the ballot, the drop-off argument. But there are some other arguments as well that I want to mention in case you're wondering, okay, well, how do I respond if people immediately raise an objection and say, no, we can't do that? One is ballot length that we've heard. The ballots will get longer. And one of the things you can say in response, if you're hearing this, well, we can't afford for the ballot to get longer, point out a lot of cities have staggered terms, so they're not going to be electing all their positions at the same time. So we're not talking about, let's say there's 9 city positions that will be moving to an even year ballot. Chances are not all 9 of those are going to appear on the exact same piece of paper, because some of them are going to be getting contested in midterm years, some are going to be tested in presidential years. And for those cities that have districts, like in Washington State, one of our biggest cities is Seattle. That is our biggest city, but that city has districts. So 7 districts of the 9 council seats, 7 are district based, and so each voter has 3 council members directly representing them. So they have 1 from their district and then 2 at large. And so if you're district based, then that means that you're not going to have 7 positions are not going to be on the same ballot for everyone. Instead, there's going to be 1 position per district. So that means the ballot won't get as long as some people might think it will. You just have to kind of reorient them to the voter's perspective, because that's actually what appears on the ballot. We've talked a little bit about drop-off, but Zoli, can you talk a little bit more about what we can say in response to people who worry that there's going to be this big drop-off of voters once they get down the ballot?
Sure, and I think Kathy said a lot about it already, so I'll be brief. But the concern, more precisely, is that someone's going to vote for president and then either get tired or be disinterested and eventually decide to drop off the ballot and not check a box for mayor, city council, or the like. That certainly occurs. So we know that in on-cycle cities, there's some level of drop-off, and sometimes as much as 15% of voters vote for president, but don't get all the way down to the lowest level office. So drop-off occurs, but we also know, as Kathy mentioned, that even after considering all of that, or even after accounting for the ballot drop-off, we see huge gains in turnout. So it's a few people drop out, but many, many, many more enter into the electoral process and cast their vote at the local level. So there's some drop-off, but the turnout gain is much larger. And then secondly, we have no evidence that ballot drop-off in these on-cycle elections is essentially distorted by race or class. So it's not like when you switch to on-cycle elections, you only are getting communities of color dropping off. It's just as likely for white voters to drop off as others. So this drop-off effect is not really hurting one group much more than another group. And again, it's being offset by greater turnout that's concentrated among communities of color, working class Americans, younger Americans.
I'll say one other thing, if I could.
Go ahead.
Another issue that proved to be somewhat helpful with certain people. We compared the cost of running a standalone election by a city to the cost of consolidating it with other elections and having the county run it. Now, the circumstances are going to be different jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but oftentimes I think you may find that consolidating an election with another thing that is already going on means that you're not paying separately for a whole set of other poll workers, polling locations, deployment. Printing of the ballot will be longer, but it's incremental, right? As opposed to like, let's print a whole thing. Plus, if you're mailing any set of those ballots to any set of people, there's all those costs. And those costs now become incrementally much less when you consolidate. And the cost savings argument was one that some of the policymakers found to be compelling, right? And depending on, the ideology of the lawmakers, sometimes being able to point out that we're talking about millions, and particularly over multiple election cycles, this starts to accumulate pretty quickly. This could be a positive thing over the long run.
Thank you so much. One of the other arguments we heard in different campaigns last year was that local issues are going to get buried if you do on-cycle elections. Chelsea, what will you say in response to those who say the local issues are going to get buried?
Yeah. What we argued proactively and in response to this is that moving local elections to even years actually elevates the importance and attention of local issues and candidates because more people are participating in those discussions and in the process. History has shown that local offices like city council simply don't attract the level of interest from the media or the public or the state or that state and federal offices do. Regardless of how strong the field of candidates is or how competitive the races are, when local offices stand on their own in an odd-numbered year, coverage is just muted, sometimes downright anemic. But by sharing that ballot with higher profile state and federal offices, we can elevate the importance of local races. With that, local contests can more effectively gain attention and media coverage. That's good for candidates, good for voters, and good for democracy. The local offices effectively can ride those coattails. In Colorado, there were a few other cities that had previously moved their local elections to even years. So in Boulder, we showed that the turnout of those local offices in even years compared to ours in off years, and there was a 20-point percentage gap. So in summary, there is a strong argument that more people that vote in local issues, the more those issues get the attention they deserve. I also want to point out in Colorado, at least, our off-cycle elections do not have the same amount of election services as in even years. We don't have the same number of drop boxes, polling stations, days where you can vote. So there's also an issue of opportunities to vote are diminished in odd years compared to even years.
All very good points. And the coattails note is really good because coattails is a powerful phenomenon in American politics and probably in other countries' politics as well. But this idea of coattails, you ride the coattails of another. I mean, we know that goes back a very long way in American elections. And I think it's very true for local offices that you just hitch a ride, right, on the presidential and the midterm elections, and you're just going to benefit from more coverage. We know the media outlets really increase their political coverage in even years because that's when the big elections are, and then they just cut back after those are over. So we want to ride those coattails and benefit. And that any locality that's thinking, our local issues are going to be ignored, the experience has been that actually local issues get more attention, not less, because of that coattails effect, that ability to get that increased availability of media coverage. We also have the issue of cost, the cost of campaigns. It's more expensive to run in an even year when you're trying to reach a larger number of voters. Augustine, can you talk about the argument that it's going to cost more, and so therefore we don't want to do it because candidates are going to have to raise more money?
Sure. So I think there's like a few points here that maybe can help fight against that argument of campaign costs are going to increase and therefore this is a bad idea. One is less money's going to have to go to get out the vote efforts. More people are going to turn out to vote. So now your campaign efforts, instead of being fully focused, your campaign costs, instead of fully focused on trying to get people to turn out to vote in this weird election in the middle of a cold winter in February, can now go to convincing them that you're the better candidate. And so there's the trade-off where at least people are getting out to vote. You can focus your money instead of trying to get people out to vote on convincing them that you're the better candidate. There might be cost savings there. A second, I think this may be what Kathy said made me think about this a little bit, is that there's often solutions that can come out of compromise. So the way that she talked about the solution from ballot drop-off, where the list of the candidates gets switched up, maybe some of the cost savings from consolidating elections can go to publicly financing campaigns, making the campaign finances more equitable, less influenced by private monies, right? There could be a compromise there. There's solutions to some of these problems. And I guess my final point would be that it's going to be hard for city councilors to explain to their voters that the reason why they're not making it easier for them to vote, the reason why they're not increasing their level of representation is because of their campaign costs, because they don't want to spend more money. So it's an argument that you definitely won't have to make in a referendum or if you're advocating for this at the state level. It's only an argument that I think maybe some city councilors will make. I think there's plenty of ways to compromise around this issue. I think it's a much smaller concern that some might make it out to be. And I don't think it's something that will sell to voters. So if it's put to the voters, I don't think that they're going to be very convinced that we should keep off-cycle elections and keep voter turnout low and unrepresentative because campaigns save money.
Thank you. We are into our last few minutes, so I'm going to invite each panelist to discuss if they have anything in their head about what's one takeaway that we haven't mentioned so far that we want those of you who are watching or listening to the panel, including those on demand, to know about what you can do if you haven't got even your elections in your locality yet. What's one thing that you should know from the success of last year's campaigns? And then after we do that, we're going to let you know where you can find more information and contact the panelists. So who'd like to go first? Who has got a takeaway they want to mention real quick?
All right, we got a lot of silence, so I'll fill the silence very, very quickly. We have mentioned this already, but I do want to highlight the fact that on-cycle elections are extraordinarily popular, and they're popular across the partisan spectrum, right? So over the last few years, there have been at least 40 cities that have put this on the ballot. It has passed in 99% of those cases, and it's passed by large margins in almost every one of those cases. In national surveys, we see that clear majorities of Republicans, clear majorities of Democrats, and clear majorities of nonpartisans and independents all favor voting once at one time rather than on multiple days for multiple different elections. So this is something that if you can get some momentum behind, is likely to be very popular in your local area.
I'm going to piggyback on what Zoli just said, and that is that both in the city, at the city level, but also at the state level, one of the ways that we built support was to create an oddball alliance. And so we had both chambers of commerce as well as labor on board. We really thought through kind of organizations that don't always have, electoral reform as part of their platform of issues, and reached out to them to think about like how does this work for you? And so we built a very large coalition of support behind this, partly because we knew that sometimes our electeds are, maybe they're not going to be responsive to Common Cause, because who cares? You don't give us any donations, but they are going to be responsive to one of these other entities. So think broadly, because what Zoli says is correct. This is actually a wildly popular idea. It's very intuitive, and there are different reasons why different groups that have much more oomph when it comes to political gamesmanship are willing to step into this and be allies on this issue. And that unusual coalition is what ultimately got us over the finish line.
Great. Anybody else have a takeaway?
Sure. I think something we haven't talked about that I'll just briefly mention is that this is a long-term strategy. This is a brilliant systemic change for the future of democracy for all of our communities. And if you don't currently have elected officials at your city council or in your state house that are willing to put forward this change, then I think it's important to get involved in those elections, finding candidates who will champion this and supporting those candidates to win is a piece that might be necessary to really shift this in a way that creates the movement that we want to see.
That's right. And if you can find a couple of elected officials to be your champions, that can be huge, because having people on the inside of the system to partner with, that was the key to how we did it so quickly in King County, because our time frame in King County was basically a year. I show up at the election night party with my team for Sarah Perry, who was running for King County Council, and saw another one of the council members who was already on the council and said, look at the low turnout. This is the third worst odd year turnout. Third worst all-time turnout in state history as well. And, here we're really feeling it here in King County. We need to change this. And she's like, let's talk. So a few months later, we reconvene, and it was about, I think, 3 to 6 weeks. We had a proposal put together. And then a few weeks after that, the council voted to send it to the voters. So we couldn't have done that without that partnership between the organizations and the activists that wanted to see this happen and the elected officials who were actually willing to go look at the data and be persuaded. So having that partnership can be critical, especially if you want to make quick change in a rapid amount of time. It is possible. And if you don't find any support of elected officials in your area, then maybe look at another level, as was mentioned, and play that long game, because you can't just stake it all in one legislative session or 1 year or one sort of span of time where you have some folks sitting in a city council, because you might have to wait for conditions to change before you can make your move. But keep plugging away, because this is popular, as was said, and there are so many people out there who want to see this happen. Okay, so we are about at time. I want to mention how you can get a hold of the Coalition for Even Year Elections and reach us if you'd like to know more about how to bring even year elections to your locality. We have a website, evenyears.org. It's really simple, evenyears.org. You just type that into your browser and you'll find a lot of data, including links to the published studies that we talked about. We're also going to be putting up some of the resources that we mentioned today. So if you're curious, like, okay, how'd they do it in Colorado, or how'd they do it in California, or how'd they do it in Washington State, we're going to publish some information for you so that you can find out. And then we'll also put up a forum where you can find links to our contacts in case you want to reach us. So thank you all for joining. I'll give the panel an opportunity to say goodbye for a moment if they'd like to deliver any final closing thoughts. But we're so glad that you spent this hour with us, and we hope that it was informative.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And if anybody needs any assistance with collecting data or presenting data for your local jurisdiction, feel free to reach out. That's something that I can support with and might be helpful in your particular needs.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're really glad to be able to spend this time with you and think that you'll benefit from the information that we're publishing. So definitely check that out. Take care, and maybe we'll see some of you in Chicago.